I had a funny I wanted to say, but that was a really good song, and I don't want to ruin it by saying a funny, so I'm not going to. I'm not going to. Turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 1. When you find your place, go ahead and stand. I will forewarn you, I'm going to read the entire first chapter. It's 21 verses. I guess against my, I don't know if better judgment is the right word to use. You all know me well enough to know I really don't like reading a large portion. Personally, I feel like I stumble over the words and my eyes start to burn like halfway through it and I lose where I'm at. I've always been tempted. I've seen preachers that have like partway through a verse just called out and, brother so-and-so, read this next 6 verses. I've always been tempted to do that. One of these days I'm going to if I feel like I'm fumbling enough over it. So be ready. I might all of a sudden just say, Brother Daniel, read the next 10 verses. Probably not, but I might. Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge and understanding, science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear the Lord my king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days. Let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink, and let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said that he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of King Cyrus. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Lord, I want to thank you for just the time that we can have in your word, Lord, and the opportunity after a few weeks of not being able to preach, Lord, of being able to preach again this evening, Lord. I know I enjoyed the time of study and preparation for this message, Lord. I know you spoke to me through it, Lord. I pray that you will use this message to speak through me and to your people tonight, Lord. I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. So back on our series here after a few weeks off of it, and just after missions month and then the revival that we had to end it. And I have to say, getting kind of back on the You Have a Choice series and just ending revival, there were a whole lot of directions that I prayed about going with this after revival. So many areas that You Have a Choice really do apply with revival. And I'm going to give you some of them before we get to the message because I really wanted to. You have a choice if you were changed. No one can make a revival meeting take hold in your life. It really doesn't matter how much pastor or I pray leading up to revival. It doesn't really matter how much he or I pray leading up to revival, and it really doesn't matter how much the preacher studies and prepares a message from God. You choose whether or not it will affect you. You have a choice whether or not revival took place, because revival starts in one person. You have a choice whether or not that was just extra services that we attended, or if revival actually happened. Because as we know, the reality is revival isn't just because we had Thursday and Friday services. Revival is God's people being revived. Revival is you getting that renewed excitement, the renewed zeal to be busy about God's work. What we had last week, as Pastor often calls it, we had preaching for revival. We prayed for revival, and Brother Males studied and prepared for revival, but revival doesn't happen because we had 2 extra services. It doesn't happen because we brought in a guest speaker. Revival takes place when you choose to be revived. You have a choice if it will last or not. So I was thinking about this, the revival services ended Sunday. Guest speaker went home Monday. And one could say revival has ended. But the reality is revival ending is a choice you and I make. Because as I've said, it's not the services, it's what happens in you. A lot that we could look at and spend time on. That's not where the message is going to go this evening. I just wanted to give you a mini message before we got to the actual message. So there's that. I got it out of my system. Now I can get back to where we're at. Tonight I want to look at Daniel, and I intend to be, in our series, I intend to be in the book of Daniel for at least the next couple of weeks. This evening I'm going to have us look at Daniel chapter 1, the choice that Daniel made here. And I know I'm going to focus on Daniel with this. I know that he wasn't alone in this decision. The Bible makes it clear. Multiple times mentions all of them together. At one point talks about the 4 of them specifically. I know it wasn't just him, but I'm going to focus on him for the point of this message this evening. And I feel like anytime I preach a message out of the book of Daniel, I need to remind us of the context that's going on here. It becomes easy for us to get used to reading our Bibles, and especially places like Daniel that we're familiar with some of the passages. And we get to where we just kind of focus on, those quote-unquote Bible stories, and we forget what they're going through. So before we start, I feel that it's necessary for us to remember this and just take a minute to remember the context of what's happening in Daniel 1. These boys have just been taken from their homes. It's believed that Daniel was somewhere around age 12 when the Babylonian army came in as a judgment from God and overtook the people. And part of what they did, as we saw in Daniel chapter 1, part of what they did was they took the choice young men. And their plan was, well, we're going to prove these young men and we'll vet them, if you will, as being good leaders and being smart and having good understanding. And then we'll spend these next 3 years indoctrinating them. They would get these young men used to their ways, and they would get them used to the way they talked, and they would get them used to the things they believe, and they would get them used to their government and the way they govern, all the way down to they would get them used to their food. All with the plan that once they had completely brainwashed these young men. They could then place them as leaders over their own people, but they'll lead our way. And just a reminder here, this was not a voluntary program. They didn't go into the people and ask them who would like to volunteer their child for this new experimental program we're going to do. They didn't go in and ask the kids, who wants to be a part of this? We're going to have fun and games and indoctrination. It's going to be good. No, they came in by force. These young men, Daniel included, but far from the only one, these young men have been kidnapped. These young men have probably witnessed their homes being destroyed. It was in battle. They probably witnessed their homes being destroyed. They probably witnessed their armies being defeated. You think about this, these boys may have witnessed their families being killed. And now they are snatched from their home and drugged to a foreign country where they're being forced to leave everything they know and forced to leave their way of life and live in a completely different way. That's the context we find ourselves in Daniel chapter 1. Can you imagine the fear? I mean, that's a terrifying situation. That's a terrifying situation. We have the luxury of, we know how the book of Daniel ends. They didn't know how this was going to go. For all they knew, they had been brought here to die. They didn't know how this was going to end. Can you imagine the fear? Can you imagine the uncertainty? I highly doubt, again, we have the benefit of, we know what happens throughout the book of Daniel. I highly doubt that the Babylonians took these young men and said, it's okay, let me explain to you exactly what our plan is for the rest of your life. I don't think that's what was going on. These young men had no idea what was about to happen to them, and it was in the middle of that situation that we find Daniel in Daniel chapter 1, where he, in verse 8, Daniel, the Bible tells us, purposed in his heart. Let me tell you what purposed in his heart means. Daniel made a choice. Not an easy choice. Not an easy choice at all. Daniel right here, Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, in the middle of all of this chaos that's happening around him, and again, after all that he saw and all that's going on, he made a choice. I'm going to follow God rather than men. In the middle of all that, I'm going to follow God rather than men. Tonight I want to look at three things in this choice that Daniel made that I think we can learn and that I think are important for us to learn. Because the reality is, we live in a world filled with uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen in our world. We can read our Bible and we have the advantage of that, and we know how it ends. But some pretty rough things have to go on to get us to that point. That leaves us with some uncertainty. We look around our world and the things that are going on and the different things politically and the wars being rumored and all those sorts of things. That leaves us with a whole lot of uncertainty. To be honest, for a lot of Christians, that causes them to live in fear. But as a child of God, we need to make the choice to follow God rather than men. The Bible makes it clear that we cannot serve two masters. We cannot serve God and man, so we have to choose. We have to choose. This isn't an optional choice. Three things about Daniel's choice tonight. Daniel's choice to follow God rather than men. Number one, Daniel's choice was despite personal pain. It was despite personal pain. Look at verse 8 with me again. But Daniel, we're going to read 8, and I think I'm going to read all the way down to 15. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs, and the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenances of the children that eat the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants, so we can send unto them in this matter and prove them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat of the portion of the king's meat. So let's just, for a moment here, look at the practical, and I don't mean to be humorous about this, but I think it will be a little bit. But I am serious about this. Let's look at the practical for a moment. This is a 12, 13-year-old male turning down food. Pulse that we see here is believed to be beans and some sort of seeds. Now, follow me here. A teenage boy who decided to follow God rather than men, and to do that, I'm going to give up the king's meat for 10 days and eat seeds. I mean, there's some humor here to be sure, because anyone who knows a teenage boy knows they don't quickly turn down food. Most 13-year-old boys, if you offer them food, they're going to accept it. Even if they aren't hungry, they'll take food because they know in 5 minutes they will be again. It's one of those things, teen activities, that always makes my wife and I laugh a little bit. I can let teenage boys eat until they are sick and can't play whatever the next game is. But if I right after that offer to let them take home, the leftover pizza, they'll take an entire box because they know they can't possibly eat anymore right now. But before they get home, they'll be ready to eat a whole pizza again. Daniel's a 12, 13-year-old boy saying, it's okay, I'd rather not eat. If you look at that from the pulse side, again, this is a teenage boy saying, hey, rather than, give me a little liberty here, rather than burger and fries, I'll take some sunflower seeds. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen, but Daniel chose, if eating the king's meat is following man rather than following God, I don't want it. That's a pretty major stand. It's a pretty major stand, but more than that, this is despite some, like I said, some personal pain. Again, being super practical here for a moment. If you decide I'm not going to eat for 10 days straight, there'll be some personal pain. I don't know about the rest of you. I like to eat. I've done, fasts and those sorts of things. I've done for even an extended period of time. And there comes a point after a few days that your body stops craving the food. But the first few days, it just hurts. Causes some personal pain, which I really think is why it is good for us to do a fast that way, because it reminds us to be in prayer, and it's giving things up that our body craves to be focused on the Lord. But for Daniel, this is giving this up, though it's causing him personal pain. That's what Daniel's saying here. I'm willing to have personal pain to choose God. Let me point this out. There's also the unknown pain. The Bible tells us that God gave Daniel favor with the prince of the eunuchs. But he didn't know exactly how the prince of the eunuchs was going to respond to this. Remember, they're not here under friendly circumstances. God may have given him favor with the prince of the eunuchs, but it's not like they're buddies. Daniel, as I said, may have seen friends and family members killed in the process of him being taken here. He's not exactly in friendly company. He's not exactly in a position where he can demand anything. For all Daniel knew, making this stand could have meant he was beaten. For all Daniel knew, taking this stand could have cost him his life. The prince of the eunuchs was scared of that. And he's over Daniel. He was scared of, hey, if I do this and you look bad, the king's going to take my head. We see later in the book of Daniel that it's not as if the Babylonians were above that later on in the book, people are punished by being thrown in a lion's den and others thrown in a fiery furnace. They had no problem being brutal. Daniel didn't know how this was going to go, but despite hunger pain, and despite unknown pain, Daniel chose God, to follow God over men. Now let's bring this point to you and I for a moment here before we move on to the next point. We need to make the choice. I'm going to follow God rather than men, even if it causes me pain. Even if it causes me personal pain, as in financial. We tend to have, and I don't know where this started, but we tend to have the mentality that if it makes financial sense, then God must be for it. If I will financially benefit from this, then it has to be God's will. I would challenge you in the Bible, find me anywhere that God's leading is shown to his people based on where they can make the most money. Maybe I'm overlooking somewhere, and if you find one, show me later. But I don't see God leading in that way. And yet it's shocking how often people who call themselves Christians, a child of God, make their decisions based on money rather than on God. I'm just going to be real blunt. When you're doing that, you're choosing to follow the leading of man, yourself, rather than God. We need to choose to follow the leading of God, even when it involves unknown pain. For example, physical pain. In America, we have never known what that really means. There are places in our world that people know that being a child of God means physical pain. And I believe it's possible that our country reaches that point, but you and I, at least in our life, have never known that sort of pain. But are you willing to choose God even if it means physical pain? I've used this example before. There is in Fox's Book of Martyrs a story where a church is holding services, and a group came in and they held the church up at gunpoint and demanded that everyone line up in the church, and right in the front they set a Bible down, and they demanded everyone has to walk by and spit on the Bible or they're going to kill them. And one by one, the congregation did. A congregation of people who are believers who would have said, I will stand for truth. But one by one, at gunpoint, they walked by and spit on the Bible. And in that story, and this is a true story, that happened one by one until a little girl came up, cleaned off the Bible and kissed it, and was shot on the spot. Here's the thing. I think we would all like to say, I would be that little girl. But I'm afraid if we won't pick God over personal gain, how can we think we would pick God over death? Like, if we won't pick God over my financial stability, if we won't pick God over this thing I want, or if we won't pick God over my desires, how can we possibly think, oh yeah, I would pick God over death? We need to make the decision that I choose to follow God despite personal pain. Daniel chose to follow God rather than men. Number two, despite it making him different. Now look at verse 15 with me. At the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which should eat the portion of the king's meat. Skip down to verse 18. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king... that is not the verse I am looking for. Verse 17, as for these four children, God gave them knowledge and skill and all learning and wisdom. And Daniel, that's not it either. All right, well, somewhere in those last 5 verses, the king notices that they are different than the others. If someone else figures out which verse it is. 20, thank you. Oh, but I heard someone else say 19. Now you're messing me up even worse. We're going to read verse 18 through 21 until I find the one I'm looking for. Now, at the end of those days, that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found, there we go, among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding the king inquired of them. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. Whoever said 19 and 20, those were both right. They were different. Now follow me here. The passage doesn't tell us how many young men were taken at the same time as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Some have made their assumptions in studying for this. I love doing this sort of thing. I looked up all sorts of different people's opinions, and they vary so much. I read everything from 20 to 10,000-ish. So there was more than just these four. Bible doesn't tell us how many that there were. I'm not going to try to give you a number. I believe it was significant. If it is not as if it was just Daniel and his three friends, because the Bible tells us that after 3 days they were compared to the others, implying there were others. Just makes some simple sense to me. So follow me on this thought here for a moment. Daniel and these three deciding, I want to follow God rather than men, and in that I can't eat the portion of the king's meat, that made them different. That made them act different. Everyone else is cutting up their steaks, while Daniel and these three boys are eating beans and seeds. You're going to tell me nobody noticed that? Oh no, they would have all seen. They would have all known Daniel is doing something different than the rest of us. I can't help but think if those young men that were taken are anything like us, I can't help but think Daniel probably would have had some critics. I can't help but think Daniel probably would have had some peer pressure. You know what, Daniel? You think you're better than us? We're all eating the king's meat. No, this choice meant he acted different from the rest. Notice, not just different from the Babylonians, different from the other young men that were also brought with him, the children of God. It made him different because he chose to follow God rather than men. This choice made him act different. This choice made him look different from the rest. The passage says at the end of 10 days, they were fairer and fatter than the others. At the end of a week and a half, he didn't look like everyone else looked because he chose to follow God rather than men. He looked different than the rest. I think you can probably figure out where I'm headed with this point. As a child of God, choosing to follow God rather than men will make you different, which really is one of the biggest struggles we have with it. The Bible tells us that we are to be in the world but not of the world, that we're supposed to be a peculiar people. We're supposed to be different, but we don't want to be. Very often, we just want to blend in. You know, why can't I be saved but a Christian in camouflage? You know, accept Christ, but then be just like everyone else. But it doesn't work that way. If you're going to choose to follow God rather than men, it's going to mean you'll act different. You won't do the same things. You won't act the same way. I have worked in a few different arenas with all sorts of different worldly guys, and let me just say this, nice people. I don't want it to sound like they were all terrible people. Some of them were terrible people, but some of them were really nice people, but worldly. And I learned that if I'm going to follow God, even if they're really nice people, I can't act like them. I'm going to have to be different. If you're going to choose to follow God rather than men, you're going to have to act different. You're going to look different. Prayerfully, not fairer and fatter like Daniel was. Doesn't mean, you follow God and you're going to be more handsome and way more, but you're going to look different. You won't dress the same because the focus won't be bring attention on you. It'll be bring attention to God. You won't look the same because the focus won't be everyone look at me, look at him. And the choice to follow God rather than men is a choice to be different. Daniel chose to follow God rather than men despite personal pain, despite it making him different. And then lastly this evening, Daniel chose to follow God rather than men despite it not being his will. Daniel, and I think I'll be able to show this through this point, Daniel was a young man led of God. We can see it in this instance. We can see it later when they made a law that they were to pray to no one other than the king. And what did Daniel do? He still went and prayed in exactly the same place, in exactly the same way he always had. He knew the consequences. I read one person who, as I was studying for this week, I read one person who said, well, it's possible, and I love how people try to explain things away. Maybe Daniel was praying when they announced the law, so he didn't hear that there was a law against him praying. Which, okay. Daniel knew the consequences, but he was led of God, not of himself, so it didn't matter. We can see it when he was interpreting dreams later in the book of Daniel, that he was led of God. We can see it in the way that he lived out his life. This guy, Daniel, lived a life led by God, not by Daniel, not by his own will. I mean, think of his life. You can't tell me being where he is by his will. He didn't move to Babylon because it advanced his career. No, he lived there because God placed him there. You can't convince me that in the situation he is in, that he wants to draw attention to himself. Where Daniel is at, I mean, this is a survival type situation. Living in the shadows and unnoticed would have seemed like the best way to survive. You can't tell me that doing this, or making this decision that he did, which would have drawn attention to himself, was his plan. You can't tell me that it was his will later to rule in Babylon the way that God used him later on. No, this was not his home. These weren't his people. He was still here, still in Babylon, not by his choice. Daniel lived his life following God rather than following his own will. Oh to God that we would have a few more Christians who would live that way. Who would make decisions that they make not off their will. Not off what benefits us, or not off of our whims or our heart or anything else goofy like that, but actually lived our life following God's leading. Instead, what we often do to make ourselves feel better is we make up in our mind on what we want to do, and we seek counsel just so we can say we did, but all we really want is for them to validate what we want, or we'll pray about it just so we can say we did, but our prayer is, God, please give me what I want. We're going to do it anyways. And this is... It's going to sound super harsh. I don't mean for it to, but I believe it's biblically based here. If that's how you're making decisions on how you live, stop pretending. Revelation 3:15 and 16. I know thy works, that thou art neither cold nor hot. I would thou wert cold or hot. So then, because thou art lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. God is saying he is sickened by Christians, makes God want to throw up when Christians are lukewarm. God saying, I would rather you just be cold than stuck in the middle. Choose to follow God's will, not your own. So, conclusion this evening. Daniel chose to follow God rather than men. That meant he chose personal pain over comfort. That meant he chose to be different rather than blending in. That meant he chose God's will and sacrificing his own. Christians in here tonight, I am pleading with you. Choose to follow God rather than men. We are, and in men I am including yourself, because we are so guilty of making our decisions based off of men's wisdom rather than God's. we are so guilty of making our decisions off of feelings, off of what makes sense to me, rather than the leading of God. Choose to follow God rather than men. Despite pain, despite it making you different, despite it not being your way. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you will, Lord, help us to grasp this concept. Lord, looking at this with Daniel, as I study this, it was really amazing to me. Looking at the situation that Daniel is in the middle of and how difficult and how harsh this situation was, and Daniel just decides, no, I'm going to follow God, not men. And yeah, that's going to mean some pain. Yeah, that's going to mean I'm going to stand out. Yeah, that's going to mean it's going against what I want. That's okay. I'm going to follow God, not myself, not man. We continue to see that example throughout his life, as I think we'll see over the next few weeks, that he just over and over decides, no, I'm going to follow God, not men. Lord, help us to be Christians. Lord, help us decide tonight, I'm just going to follow God. I'm going to follow his leading. Regardless of if that causes some pain, regardless of if that makes me different, regardless of that being against what I might maybe want, I'm just going to follow God. I'm going to choose to seek what he wants for my life and just do that. It's in your name, amen. Let's all go ahead and stand with heads bowed and eyes closed tonight. We're going to begin the invitation song in just a moment. I said in the message, I'm pleading with you tonight. Let's choose. I'm going to be a Christian who's not pretending. I'm going to be a child of God who really seeks to follow God. That I am looking for his leading in my life, and then when he gives it, I'm going to follow it. Regardless of if that causes me pain, regardless of if that makes me different, set aside, regardless of that goes against what I want, I'm just going to follow God. So as we begin to sing this evening, the invitation's open.